The most dangerous mistake a soldier can make is believing they already know everything about the person standing in front of them. The morning sun rose over Camp Pendleton, California, casting long shadows across the Marine training grounds where a new group of cadets prepared for another day of discipline, focus, and responsibility. The air carried the familiar sounds of boots moving across pavement, instructors giving directions, and equipment being prepared for training exercises. Among the organized movement, one person stood apart from everyone else. He was an older man walking slowly near the edge of the training area, wearing a simple jacket and carrying a small worn bag. His name was Frank Dalton. To most of the young cadets, he looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn. He did not look like the kind of person they expected to see around an active Marine training facility. He had gray hair, a quiet expression, and the calm posture of someone who had spent a lifetime observing more than speaking. Lieutenant Ethan Walker noticed him while reviewing the morning schedule. At 34 years old, Ethan had built his reputation on discipline and attention to detail. He believed in preparation, procedures, and making sure every situation was handled correctly. When he saw an unfamiliar person near the training area, his instincts told him to investigate. A few cadets nearby also noticed the older man. They whispered among themselves, wondering why he was there. Frank did not appear nervous. He did not try to explain himself. He simply stood quietly, looking across the training grounds, as if remembering something from a different time. Ethan approached with a professional attitude. He asked Frank who he was and why he was near the restricted area. Frank answered politely, but his words were brief. "I used to spend a lot of time around places like this," he said. The response only created more questions. The cadets looked at each other, unsure what to think. In their minds, military history belonged to books, photographs, and lessons from instructors. They did not expect history to be standing only a few feet away from them. Ethan continued following protocol. He asked for identification and waited for clarification. Frank calmly reached toward his personal belongings, causing the nearby cadets to become alert. The moment felt tense, not because of anger or danger, but because everyone realized they did not understand the situation. Then Frank stopped and looked at the young faces watching him. There was no frustration in his eyes, only patience. It was the look of someone who had seen many generations come and go. Ethan noticed something unusual about him. The older man was not acting like someone trying to gain attention. He was acting like someone who had already lived through moments that others could only imagine. Still, no one knew the truth about Frank Dalton. No one knew the history hidden behind the quiet voice, the faded jacket, and the simple appearance of an ordinary elderly man. The cadets only saw what was in front of them. They did not yet understand that sometimes the people who seem the least important are the ones carrying the greatest stories. The next morning at Camp Pendleton, the story of the quiet older man continued to spread among the cadets. Not because Frank Dalton had caused a scene, but because he had done the opposite. He had remained calm when everyone around him was uncertain. To the young Marines in training, that silence was difficult to understand. They were used to seeing confidence displayed through strong voices, quick decisions, and visible authority. Frank showed something different. He carried himself with a quiet patience that made people wonder what experiences had shaped him. Lieutenant Ethan Walker reviewed the situation from the previous day while sitting inside the training office. He looked through the information available and found nothing that immediately explained why an elderly man had been near the training area. There was no simple answer, no obvious reason, only more questions. Ethan believed in doing things correctly, and that meant finding the truth before making assumptions. He decided to speak with Frank again. When he found him near a quiet section of the base, Frank was sitting alone, looking across the training grounds. The older veteran watched the cadets moving through their routines with a thoughtful expression. Ethan approached respectfully and asked about his connection to the Marine Corps. Frank looked toward the young Marines and smiled slightly. "The Corps has a way of staying with you," he said. The answer was simple, but it carried a weight Ethan could not explain. Frank did not talk about achievements or recognition. He did not mention titles or important moments from his past. He spoke about lessons. He spoke about responsibility. He spoke about how every generation of Marines had something important to learn from the generation before them. Ethan noticed that every time the conversation moved toward Frank himself, the older man redirected attention back to service and teamwork. That made Ethan even more curious. Meanwhile, some of the cadets continued discussing who Frank might be. A few believed he was simply a visitor with an interesting past. Others wondered why someone with such a calm presence seemed so familiar with military life. One cadet named Tyler Morgan noticed something unusual. While Frank adjusted his old jacket, Tyler saw a small faded Marine symbol attached inside. It was not displayed proudly. It looked like something carefully preserved over many years. Tyler mentioned it to Ethan, who immediately became more interested. Ethan understood that small details often carried important stories. He asked Frank about the patch, but Frank only looked down at it for a moment before answering. "Some things remind us where we came from," he said. Then he changed the subject. That response stayed with Ethan. The lieutenant had met many experienced service members during his career, but Frank was different. Most people with impressive backgrounds wanted others to know about them. Frank seemed determined to keep his story private. As the day continued, the cadets returned to their training, but their view of the old man had started to change. They no longer saw him as someone who did not belong. They saw him as someone they did not yet understand. And somewhere beneath the quiet conversations, a question began forming in everyone's mind. Who exactly was Frank Dalton, and why did he seemed like someone who had already earned the respect of people who did not even know his name? The third morning at Camp Pendleton began with the same rhythm the cadets had known for weeks. The sound of training exercises filled the air, instructors guided their teams, and every Marine focused on improving discipline and responsibility. But one thing had changed. The old man near the edge of the training grounds was no longer just a stranger. Frank Dalton had become a quiet mystery that everyone wanted to understand. Lieutenant Ethan Walker noticed the change among the cadets. They were no longer whispering with suspicion. They were watching with curiosity. The difference was small, but important. Ethan understood that respect often begins with the willingness to learn. Later that day, Ethan invited Frank to sit with a group of cadets during a short leadership discussion. Frank initially tried to decline, but Ethan explained that the young Marines could benefit from hearing different perspectives. Frank agreed, not because he wanted attention, but because he believed every generation deserved guidance. The cadets gathered around as Frank looked across the group. He did not begin with stories of achievements or moments of recognition. Instead, he asked them a simple question. What do you think makes someone a good Marine? The answers came quickly. Some mentioned discipline. Others mentioned teamwork, commitment, and courage. Frank listened carefully to each response. Then he nodded. Those things matter, he said. But never forget that being a Marine is also about how you treat people when nobody is watching. The words were simple, but they made the group quiet. Ethan noticed the effect Frank had on them. The older veteran was not teaching through commands. He was teaching through perspective. After the discussion, one of the cadets, Tyler Morgan, approached Frank and asked about the faded Marine symbol he had noticed. Frank looked at the patch for a moment. His expression changed slightly, as if remembering a distant time. That belonged to a different chapter of my life, he said. Tyler asked if Frank had served with a Marine unit. Frank smiled. I spent many years wearing the same uniform you are learning to respect today. That answer created even more questions. Ethan watched carefully. He realized Frank was not hiding his past because he was ashamed of it. He was protecting the humility that had guided him throughout his life. Meanwhile, Ethan decided to look deeper into Frank's background. He contacted the appropriate channels to verify the information without making assumptions. He wanted facts, not rumors. As he searched through old records, he began finding small pieces of information that connected together. A familiar surname, a service history from decades earlier, references from people who had served before him. Nothing was confirmed yet, but the possibility became impossible to ignore. The older man standing quietly at Camp Pendleton might not have been an ordinary visitor. He might have been someone whose story had been forgotten by time. That evening, Ethan looked again at the training grounds where Frank had first appeared. The same place where people had questioned him was now becoming the place where they began to understand him. But the biggest discovery was still waiting. The cadets knew Frank had a story. They just did not know how remarkable that story truly was. The information Lieutenant Ethan Walker discovered that afternoon changed the way he looked at the quiet man who had appeared at Camp Pendleton. At first, Frank Dalton was simply an unfamiliar face near a training area. Then he became a person of curiosity. Now, Ethan began to realize there was a deeper story hidden behind the calm expression and simple words. Inside the base administration office, Ethan reviewed the details he had gathered. The records were incomplete, but the pieces slowly began connecting. Frank Dalton was not just a former Marine. He had once been part of a generation of service members whose dedication had shaped the standards that younger Marines followed today. Ethan paused as he read through the information. The name appeared in old references from years earlier. It was mentioned by people who described a Marine known for leadership, discipline, and a quiet commitment to his team. The most surprising part was that Frank had never mentioned any of it. When Ethan later found Frank near the training field, he approached differently. The questions were no longer based on suspicion. They were based on respect. "Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" Ethan asked. Frank looked toward the young cadets practicing nearby. For a moment, the old veteran remained silent. Then he answered calmly, "Because who I was matters less than what I learned." Ethan listened carefully. Frank explained that every person who served had a responsibility to pass something forward. Not a title, not a reputation, a lesson. He believed the purpose of experience was not to make others feel small. It was to help others become better. Later that day, Tyler Morgan and several other cadets learned that Frank had a connection to Marine history they never expected. The same man they had questioned days earlier had once been someone many Marines looked up to. The revelation changed the atmosphere around the training grounds. The cadets who once wondered why he was there now approached him with genuine interest. They asked about leadership, discipline, and what had changed over the years. Frank answered every question with patience. He did not compare generations or criticize modern methods. Instead, he reminded them that every era had its own challenges. "The tools may change," he said, "but the responsibility remains the same." Those words stayed with the cadets. Ethan noticed something important. Frank was not impressive because of a name in an old record. He was impressive because the person described in those records was the same person standing in front of them today. The years had passed, but his character had remained unchanged. That evening, Ethan received a message from Colonel Daniel Reeves, a senior Marine officer who had reviewed the information about Frank. The message was short. It contained only one sentence. "You should hear the story from someone who was there." Ethan looked at the message for several seconds. He knew that whatever came next would reveal a part of Marine history that most of the cadets had never known. The old man they had underestimated was about to become the person they would never forget. The following morning at Camp Pendleton, the atmosphere around the training grounds felt different. The cadets still followed their schedules, instructors still guided their lessons, and the routines of military life continued as usual. But something had changed. The old man they once viewed as an unknown visitor was now someone they wanted to understand. Lieutenant Ethan Walker arrived early and waited near the administration building, knowing Colonel Daniel Reeves would soon arrive. Ethan had spent years around Marines, and he understood the importance of learning from those who had carried the responsibility before him. When Colonel Reeves entered the area, his expression immediately changed after seeing Frank Dalton standing near the training field. It was not surprise alone. It was recognition. The colonel walked toward Frank with a level of respect that immediately caught the attention of everyone nearby. The cadets stopped what they were doing and watched quietly. Frank simply nodded, as if seeing an old friend after many years. "It has been a long time," Colonel Reeves said. Frank smiled. "It has." For the younger Marines watching, the moment answered a question they had carried for days. Frank was not just someone with an interesting past. He was someone who had earned the respect of people who understood service at the highest level. Colonel Reeves later spoke with Ethan privately. He explained that Frank Dalton had been part of a remarkable period in Marine history. He was known not because he searched for recognition, but because he consistently placed the people around him first. His leadership came from patience, responsibility, and the ability to remain calm when others needed direction. Ethan listened carefully. He realized that the qualities described by the colonel were the same qualities he had already seen in Frank. The records had simply given a name to what was already obvious. Later that afternoon, Colonel Reeves invited Frank to speak with the cadets. Frank stood in front of the group, but he did not act like someone giving a speech. He spoke like a mentor sharing advice. He told them that uniforms, ranks, and awards were important parts of military service, but they were not the reason people remembered someone. "People remember how you made them feel when things were difficult," Frank said. "They remember whether you helped them grow." The cadets listened closely. Many of them had expected a story about accomplishments from the past. Instead, they received a lesson about character. Tyler Morgan looked at Frank differently now. He realized the greatest thing about the older veteran was not the history behind his name. It was the humility he carried despite that history. Ethan noticed the same thing. The situation had started with uncertainty, but it had transformed into something much more valuable. It became a lesson about judgment, respect, and the importance of understanding before forming opinions. As the sun began to set over Camp Pendleton, Frank walked away from the training area just as quietly as he had arrived. But this time, no one saw him as an ordinary visitor. They saw him as a reminder that some of the most important stories are carried by people who never feel the need to tell them. The days after Colonel Daniel Reeves revealed Frank Dalton's history brought a new feeling to Camp Pendleton. The training continued, the responsibilities remained the same, and the cadets still faced the challenges expected of future Marines. But their perspective had changed. They no longer looked at experience as something belonging only to the past. They began to understand that every generation stood on the foundation built by those who came before them. Lieutenant Ethan Walker noticed this change more than anyone. The young Marines were asking better questions. They were listening more carefully. They were beginning to understand that leadership was not only about giving instructions. It was about learning from every person who could offer wisdom. One afternoon, Ethan found Frank Dalton sitting near the edge of the training area, watching the cadets complete their exercises. The older veteran looked peaceful, almost like someone simply enjoying the familiar environment. Ethan sat beside him and thanked him for taking the time to speak with the younger generation. Frank nodded. "They are the future," he said. "The best thing we can do is prepare them well." Ethan looked toward the training field and thought about how different everything seemed from the first day. Back then, Frank was a stranger. Now, he was someone the cadets approached with respect and genuine curiosity. Ethan admitted that he had made assumptions before knowing the full story. Frank listened without judgment. "That happens to everyone," he said. "The important thing is what you do after you realize there is more to learn." Those words stayed with Ethan. They represented the lesson Frank had quietly demonstrated since arriving at the base. He never demanded respect. He earned it through patience, kindness, and the example he set. Later that week, Tyler Morgan and several other cadets gathered around Frank one more time. They asked about his years in the Marine Corps and what had changed most since his time in uniform. Frank thought carefully before answering. The equipment changes. The technology improves. The world moves forward. But the values that hold people together remain the same. The cadets listened closely because they understood that Frank was not talking about the past. He was talking about their future. He wanted them to become the kind of Marines who respected others, accepted responsibility, and remembered that every person had a story they might not see at first. Before leaving Camp Pendleton, Frank visited the training grounds one final time. He looked across the same area where he had first been questioned. The place that once carried uncertainty now carried something different. It carried understanding. Ethan and the cadets stood nearby as Frank prepared to leave. There was no grand ceremony and no attempt to make the moment bigger than it needed to be. Frank preferred it that way. Ethan extended his hand and thanked him again. Frank smiled and replied, "Just make sure the next generation learns to look beyond the surface." As Frank walked away, the cadets watched quietly. They had learned a lesson that would remain long after the day ended. A person's value is not always visible at first glance. Sometimes, the quietest individuals carry the greatest stories. And sometimes, the greatest legends are the ones who never need to announce who they are. The weeks following Frank Dalton's departure from Camp Pendleton carried a different energy throughout the training grounds. The cadets returned to their regular schedules, but something important had changed in the way they viewed their responsibilities. The lessons from the quiet veteran remained with them, not because he demanded attention, but because his actions showed them a different kind of leadership. Lieutenant Ethan Walker noticed the difference every day. The cadets were more thoughtful when working together. They listened more carefully to their instructors and to each other. They began to understand that experience was not something that competed with progress. It was something that helped guide it. One morning, Ethan walked through the training area and saw Tyler Morgan helping another cadet with a difficult assignment. The younger Marine approached the task with patience instead of frustration. Ethan recognized the influence immediately. Frank Dalton's impact had never been about giving orders. It had been about changing the way people thought. Later that week, Colonel Daniel Reeves invited Ethan to a leadership meeting with several Marine instructors. The discussion focused on how to prepare future generations of service members. Ethan shared the story of Frank's visit and explained how one unexpected encounter had changed the perspective of an entire training group. He admitted that the biggest lesson was not about military history. It was about judgment. We often decide who someone is before we understand where they came from, Ethan said. The challenge is learning to see the person before making the assumption. The instructors agreed. They had all seen how quickly people could be evaluated based on age, appearance, or first impressions. Frank's story reminded them that experience often arrived in unexpected forms. Meanwhile, Frank continued his quiet life away from the base. He spent his mornings working in his small garage, maintaining old tools and organizing personal items he had collected. Over the years, he never expected attention from the Marines. He considered his visit a simple opportunity to share a few lessons with people who were beginning their own journey. One afternoon, Frank received a letter from Camp Pendleton. Inside was a message from Ethan and the cadets. They thanked him for his time and explained how much his words had influenced them. Frank read the letter carefully and placed it beside an old photograph from his years of service. He smiled because he understood something important. The greatest reward was never recognition. It was knowing that a lesson had reached someone who needed it. Months later, new cadets at Camp Pendleton heard about Frank Dalton. The story was not told as a tale about a famous Marine. It was told as a reminder that every person carries experiences others may never see. The instructors used his story to teach a simple principle. Respect should not depend on what someone appears to be at first glance. It should come from understanding, patience, and the willingness to learn. Ethan often thought back to the first day he saw Frank standing near the training area. He remembered the uncertainty, the questions, and the assumptions that surrounded the older man. Now he remembered something else. He remembered how quickly those assumptions disappeared once people took the time to listen. The lesson from Frank Dalton became part of the culture at Camp Pendleton, not because of a title or a ceremony, but because a quiet veteran reminded everyone that true leadership is measured by the impact left behind. Time continued to move forward at Camp Pendleton, but the influence of Frank Dalton remained present in ways that no one expected. The training grounds looked the same each morning. The same paths were walked, the same lessons were taught, and the same commitment to excellence continued. Yet something within the people had changed. The cadets who once judged a person by what they saw first had learned to look deeper. Lieutenant Ethan Walker often noticed this during his daily responsibilities. He saw younger Marines treating each other with more patience and understanding. He saw instructors using Frank's story as an example of why character mattered as much as skill. The lesson was simple, but it carried a lasting impact. A person's value could not always be recognized immediately. Sometimes it required time, humility, and the willingness to listen. One afternoon, Ethan received a message from Colonel Daniel Reeves asking him to visit the base history office. Inside, the colonel showed him several archived materials connected to Frank's years of service. There were photographs, written records, and notes from Marines who had worked alongside him decades earlier. Ethan looked through the documents quietly. What stood out was not a list of accomplishments. What stood out were the comments from people who remembered Frank as a mentor, a teammate, and someone who always placed others before himself. Colonel Reeves explained that many people spend their lives searching for recognition, but the most respected leaders are often those who focus on helping others succeed. Ethan thought about the first day Frank arrived at the training grounds. He remembered how quickly everyone formed an opinion based on limited information. The difference between that moment and now was enormous. Frank had not changed. The people around him had. Later that month, Ethan invited several senior cadets to discuss what they had learned from the experience. Tyler Morgan shared his thoughts with the group. He explained that before meeting Frank, he believed experience was something connected only to age and history. Afterward, he understood that experience was a responsibility. It was something meant to be shared. The discussion continued as the cadets reflected on their own futures. They realized that one day they would become the experienced members of a new generation. The lessons they carried forward would influence people they had not even met yet. Far away from the training grounds, Frank Dalton continued his quiet routine. He spent time repairing old equipment in his workshop, reading, and enjoying the simple moments of everyday life. He occasionally received messages from Marines who wanted to thank him for his advice. Each time, he responded with the same humility. He reminded them that the future belonged to them and that their choices would define the next chapter of service. One evening, Frank looked at an old Marine photograph resting on his desk. He thought about the many people he had met throughout his life and the lessons each one had taught him. He understood that every generation leaves something behind. Not always a name, not always a story that becomes widely known. Sometimes, the greatest legacy is simply the positive influence one person leaves on another. At Camp Pendleton, the cadets carried that lesson forward. They no longer saw Frank Dalton as an old man from another time. They saw him as a reminder that history is not only found in books and records. Sometimes, history is standing quietly in front of you, waiting for someone to take the time to understand. Years after Frank Dalton first appeared at Camp Pendleton, the memory of that unexpected day remained one of the most meaningful lessons for everyone who witnessed it. The training grounds continued to prepare new generations of Marines, but the story of the quiet veteran became part of the culture that shaped how people viewed leadership and respect. Lieutenant Ethan Walker often thought about the difference between the person he first saw and the person he later understood. In reality, Frank had never changed. He had always been patient, respectful, and dedicated to helping others. The change happened within the people who took the time to listen. One morning, Ethan walked across the same area where Frank had first stood years earlier. He watched new cadets moving through their training, carrying the same determination and ambition as those before them. He saw instructors reminding them about discipline, teamwork, and responsibility. But he also heard something else. He heard younger Marines reminding each other to never judge someone too quickly. That lesson had become part of their daily actions. Colonel Daniel Reeves later joined Ethan at the training field. Together, they watched another generation begin its journey. The colonel smiled as he remembered the moment he recognized Frank after so many years. Some people spend their lives trying to make sure they are remembered, he said. Frank spent his life making sure others were prepared. Ethan understood exactly what he meant. Frank's greatest contribution was never about a title or a story from the past. It was about the people who became better because they met him. Tyler Morgan, now more experienced and confident, often shared Frank's lesson with younger cadets. He told them that the most important thing he learned was not about military history or old achievements. It was about humility. A person could carry decades of experience and still choose to listen. A person could have earned respect and still choose kindness. That was the example Frank left behind. Meanwhile, Frank continued living quietly away from the spotlight. He never searched for recognition and never expected people to tell stories about him. He enjoyed his peaceful routine, his small workshop, and the memories of a life dedicated to service. When people asked him about his past, he rarely focused on himself. Instead, he talked about the people beside him, the lessons they shared, and the importance of helping those who would come next. Years later, many Marines who passed through Camp Pendleton heard about Frank Dalton. They heard about the old veteran who arrived as a stranger and left behind a lesson that lasted far beyond his visit. They learned that true leadership was not always loud. Sometimes it appeared through patience, humility, and quiet actions. They learned that a uniform could represent service, but character represented the person wearing it. Frank Dalton never needed to announce who he was. The respect around him told the story. And for everyone who met him, the lesson remained clear. The people who seem ordinary at first glance may carry extraordinary histories. Sometimes, the greatest legends are the ones who quietly remind others what honor truly means.